The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. A shootout with a pirate, a train disaster, and a chow mein that's been passed down to generations that were forced to move away. These are just some of the stories you'll find in A Place Called Cumberland. It's a new book from the village's museum and archives that brings together 12 different tales from Cumberland's past. It covers topics from labor organizing to a first-hand account of growing up in Cumberland's Chinatown to the story behind the bike trails that play a big part in the community's identity today. Over the next half hour, we're going to explore some of those stories and what they say about the spirit of the 5,000 or so person village you'll find tucked just outside of the Comox Valley.
My name is Rhonda Bailey. I worked on the Cumberland project as the developmental editor, and I'm really pleased to have been part of the team that put this together.
What kind of understanding of Cumberland did you take away from after going through this process of editing all of these stories from its past?
I now see Cumberland as a sort of microcosm of the province and in the way it developed from the immigration of different groups, right from the early coal mining days up until now, when people are moving there because they want the outdoor lifestyle, the mountain biking, and the Mount Washington being nearby and Comox Lake. So what shows up in the book is the development of this town, but I think it's also a record of immigration to BC.
And could you maybe sketch out a bit for folks who haven't had the chance to do a deep dive on Cumberland or BC history, maybe the broad outline of what that pattern looks like?
Well, the book begins with a story called Circa 1999, and it's the only one of the stories that's not in chronological order because it gives the book a sense of place, right? There's a line where the character says, "So where are you? I'm in a place called Cumberland," right? And I just feel like everyone who came to Cumberland for whatever reason would ask themselves that question: what am I doing here? Where am I? And I love the title for the book, A Place Called Cumberland. You really get a strong sense of place from these stories, which are a kind of social history. It's the people who have lived in Cumberland telling their stories. Or in a couple of cases, historians telling their stories.
I got this sense, especially that essay you referenced, set around 1999, just before the turn of the millennium. Reading through the book, and just going to Cumberland, now you get a sense that now it's this sort of really vibrant, very maybe welcoming, charming, enchanting to tourists place, lots of trails, lots of nature. But you get a sense that circa 25 and for a few maybe decades before that it wasn't necessarily always like that. And that there was, I think the book, an author uses the phrase Scumberland was a way that people would sort of derisively refer to the town. What do you think it's important for people to know about that? Or what do you take away from tracing maybe the history of that to where it is now?
Well, I think that Scumberland, okay, yes, it was a place where it was in disrepair, right? The coal mining had shut down and so had the lumber industry. And I know, now I'm not an expert on this, but I know that there was a time when there were a lot of vacant houses and people would move there because they could afford to get a place to live, right? Like the woman in the first story. But, she stayed for decades. And people really developed a sense of community in that town, right? And I think it's still the same.
It just seems so shocking to me today in 2024, the idea that a place like that could ever be somewhere other than really alluring and really enchanting. And I don't know, it maybe makes me wonder about What is the place today that people sort of have a negative attitude towards, that in 20 years is going to be really prosperous and the property values will have shot up, et cetera,
Yes,
et cetera?
I can't answer that question. Maybe you could find it and invest there. Yeah. Yeah. People did buy, the old houses from the coal mining days, which were really well built with, local lumber, pure fur, and restore them and live there comfortably. And every time I go to Cumberland, I start looking at the real estate. Maybe I'll move there. It's a really it's a welcoming place, but it still has that sense of history.
At the same time, though, there seems to be a bit of a tension between that idea that the property has shot up in value, and maybe it's talked about in one of the final essays of the book, the idea that the opportunity to come and make something of this place without having to be really, really rich at the start of it, that's something that no longer exists, a past that, we can read about, but we can't touch. And I'm wondering what you make of that.
I learned that from the stories, as you did. I didn't know that. I knew a bit about the history because I had worked on other books on coal mining. What I found the last story particularly interesting with the First Nations experience, right? And the difficulty in building affordable housing, I think we kind of touched on everything about the town, but not deeply, right? So I don't want to pass myself off as an expert on Cumberland. I am a professional editor, and I was hired to help develop this book, and I became part of the team, which I truly enjoyed.
What do you think it's important for someone who is maybe nearby to a community or is maybe like a visitor to a community? What do you think is important from that perspective to know, to read about, to carry with you as you go to a community that is not your own?
Well, I think it's important to explore it. Take the museum's tour. They have a lovely tour, shows you around the town and enriches your knowledge of the place. For me, I think I may have told you this, my grandmother came from Cumberland, England, and I've always felt a kind of connection just for that. And I had a great uncle who lived there and I believe worked in the mines, and he and my great aunt are buried in the cemetery. There are at least 3 cemeteries that are there, the Chinese, the Japanese, and the general cemetery. It's interesting to know about the labor history, right? It helps you understand why Vancouver Island mostly votes NDP. We have a long history of unions, the fight for workers' rights. That really began in Cumberland. There were strikes, strike breakers. It's interesting to know about Ginger Goodwin, right? A mythological now character.
And in the book, it almost is like, well, everyone kind of knows a little bit about Ginger Goodwin. So instead, let's talk about Joe Naylor.
I was fascinated by the Joe Naylor story. And the man who wrote that is, a respected labor historian. So I learned a lot working on that book. Mm-hmm.
So the next time, maybe the first time you went to Cumberland after working on the book, did things change for you? Did you look at the town through a different lens?
Yes. Well, I finally went to see the old Chinatown. I had never done that. I went to Coal Creek. I made a deliberate, while I was still working on the book, I thought it's ridiculous. I don't know this. I need to go there. So a friend and I went there and walked around, and it was very moving for me because, I now knew the background. I knew who actually lived there. And I still find it very moving to walk through Chinatown, and there's nothing much left. There are just signs that describe what was there. And then I want to walk over to the Japanese town, and I was there in the spring, maybe early summer, and see the flowering cherries that have been planted there to, honor the memory of the Japanese who lived there. There's nothing left there either except these trees and some old apple trees. So I found it touched me more because I understood the history more. Mm-hmm.
And speaking of those parts of the history that maybe it feels like physically little remains of them, it feels like maybe they're no longer there. What do you think knowing them will change for people? Like, how do you think people can carry some of that history? What role do you think it plays in the town now as, like you say, some of the physical evidence is no longer there, or is like the physical evidence that is there almost reinforces the change that's happened, how it's not there?
Well, what I find moving is the attachment that people still feel to Cumberland. If you read the story by Tom Wong, it's called Cumberland, Chinatown, My Hometown. Descendants of the Chinese people who lived there still feel attached to it, and they have a Chinatown picnic, I believe, every summer to get together. The fact that the descendants of the Japanese came there and planted cherry trees, I think it's very moving. And also that the village itself has preserved those sites.
Is there anything else we haven't talked about today that you think it's important to bring to the conversation or share with people about Cumberland?
I think it's important to stress the community project that this was. For me, that was one of the things that appealed to me. I'd never worked on a project like this. I'd always been the editorial director, the managing editor, and I developed the book totally on my own, with the writer. But in this case, we had a committee. We had a supporter, a philanthropic person who was donating towards the project. We had Roz, who had a vision for the book as the museum director. Did I mention the little committee? I think I did. Anyway, it was interesting the way it came together with 12 writers, all writing individually, sending in their stories, and putting the manuscript together. And that was really what I did. Is I found a structure for the book, which is chronological, I would say, mostly, and the themes that run through it, right? There's some really interesting themes I didn't mention, like racism, class consciousness, women's roles. And that first story sort of sets that out. And we had a female entrepreneur who's has a story in the book. Her story is in the book. And a female scientist who came out of Cumberland. And the focus on, I think, that sense of home, how you develop a sense of home once you move there. You think that you're just going to pass through, but some people stayed. And I took a tour group from a club I belong to Cumberland about a month ago. And what was really striking there was that the museum showed us 3 cemeteries. And those cemeteries are fascinating, right? And the Japanese one in particular is very beautiful. So there's a strong sense of the passage of time, I think.
Rhonda Bailey is the editor of A Place Called Cumberland.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada and generous listeners like you. Support and grow our nonprofit newsroom project today at chly.ca/donate with a monthly or one-time donation. With your support, we can expand Midcoast Morning from 2 to 3 original programs per week to cover local news, current affairs, and arts and culture.
Today on the program, we're exploring A Place Called Cumberland. It's a book from Cumberland's Museum and Archives that brings together 12 creative nonfiction stories that tell different slices of the community's history. One of those stories features a pirate leading a double life who met his end at the hangman's noose.
My name is Dave Flaws. I'm a freelance writer, a freelance editor. I'm the publisher of VancouverIslandHistory.com, a website where we explore the unexpected history of Vancouver Island.
And so you get invited to be a part of this history project that's sharing stories from Cumberland's past. What was your first reaction to all of that?
Oh, I was super stoked and kind of like surprised that my previous work had kind of like been noticed and led them to, reaching out.
And so how did you decide on what story you were going to share?
Well, funnily enough, I was already working on a research story that appears in the book in a creative writing class at VIU. I'd begun it, and so Rosalind reached out, and I was like, "Oh, I have the perfect thing. It's not totally about Cumberland, but it's connected to Cumberland because it takes place in Union Bay, which is back then connected by rail to Cumberland and much more closely intertwined."
Okay, and so what is that story? What happened that you wanted to recount?
So this is the story I decided to write for this collection was about the Flying Dutchman. So this was a guy who was a pirate on the coast here in both the States and Canada. And he ended up breaking into a store in Union Bay multiple times. And eventually the police laid a trap for him. And there was a big shootout. This was like one of the most famous shootouts in island history kind of thing. And so in researching for this, I started to look through all the previously written versions. And there were probably like around 6 over the last 100 years. And I noticed inconsistencies between them. So like, I just asked myself, like, okay, what really was the weather like that day? Or like, what were the ordered events? So I ended up pulling the murder case file from the archives in Ottawa and prison records from Washington State, just to like get a clear picture. And yeah, those proved very illuminating because they didn't only answer these small details, but they kind of brought this bigger question of like, hey, did this guy deserve what his final judgment was for what ended up being accusation of murder, and he was executed, right? So did he deserve that? That's the kind of the story I brought to them.
So flashing forward more than 100 years to 2024, what do you think this story has to teach us today about the place?
Yeah, so, in the way to travel the BC coast back then was by water, and Cumberland really was an isolated place. And with, there's roads and highways everywhere. So like the old connection between Cumberland and the rest of the world, the isolation is mostly gone now. But I think the isolation lives on in, you might call it old Cumberland. Kind of like when the place is isolated, I guess there's no choice but just to figure things out, do it yourself. And yeah, over 3 or 4 generations, I think this attitude has been passed down, and you can see it in things like the mountain bike trails. So like in the book, Andrew Finlay's story outlined, the history of mountain biking in Cumberland. And I think today there's a permit process if you want to build a trail in Cumberland. But back in the day, we would build trails. We just go over there and do it, I don't know. It's just kind of like that. That spirit lives on in that way.
Yeah, maybe more broadly, having read all of the other stories in this collection, all about Cumberland from different angles, different viewpoints, different periods in time, what kind of things did you take away about the community?
I think stories about our communities, even if they're written about before, are never done being told. What I mean by this is that it's up to each generation to share these stories again and again, to bring them into a contemporary context and to fit them into the zeitgeist. Like, these may be stories about the past, but they're really reflections of us now. And readers in the future are going to get a sense of us, the writers, and our perspectives by analyzing how we wrote about the past.
What do you feel like maybe the ethos of Cumberland today is?
Yeah, no, it's just something that's in flux. I mean, I guess that's probably true throughout history. The ethos. Yeah, I guess I would ask what you mean exactly by ethos.
As someone who is closer to the community and has spent time in the community, when you think of, this is Cumberland, this is what it is like to live in Cumberland, as opposed to another place, What do you think sets it apart?
Yeah, I don't know. They could just bring up images. I'll start with that. I'll just bring up some images now, and just from my personal experience, growing up in the area, it's like mountain biking, huge, right? I spent so much time here growing up, going up into these mountains and building trails, mountain biking, all that stuff. Lucky Logger beer, funny enough, it's just like this thing that's like so embedded in the community, or at least it was. I mean, that's starting to fade now, right? It's like, especially as craft beers has grown up. But yeah, those are like two huge ones. Man, it was so different. Like maybe 15, 20 years ago. Like there's stray dogs running the street. I think there's one stop sign on Main Street. There's 4 stop signs now. Huge changes. and yeah, I know there's more. There's still kids on motorbikes zooming around, but there were definitely more back then. Just like 2-stroke motorbikes going right up Main Street and quads and all that stuff, it's way different now. It's busier and there's change. I don't know. I'm not super nostalgic or anything. I'm just like, it's all cool that things move forward, progress. It's just, there's positives and negatives to that. But yeah, I think in general, from my perspective, that's what I've seen.
Dave Flaws speaking about his contribution to the book A Place Called Cumberland. I also spoke with a longtime resident who was inspired to do some digging into 2 people left out when the story of one of Cumberland's biggest disasters was first being written.
My name is Kim Vanderman, and I'm an author, and I live in Cumberland, BC. I also volunteer quite a bit with the museum, and I used to work with the museum long ago when I was a high school student. So I've had kind of long connections with the museum. And when we started to put this book together, I was really touched and honored that they asked me to participate. And it was a fantastic opportunity and experience just to work with so many other authors.
So you get invited to be part of this group of storytellers. You're going to contribute to a collection on Cumberland. What was that like? How did you decide what story to tell?
Well, I wrote a novel back in 2011 called Bucket of Blood, which takes place in Cumberland in 1898. And in the course of making that novel, of researching that novel, I did tons of research into Cumberland's history and tried to recreate Cumberland as it was. And one of the stumbling points I found when researching that book was just the amount of racism, whole swaths of people being left out of the story because they weren't Caucasian. And I found it really frustrating. So when I was asked to contribute a story to this book, I really wanted to talk about the place that racism has had in Cumberland's history and how it's very difficult to get a full picture of what Cumberland's history is without those other voices there being heard. So I ended up writing a short piece about research, actually, and just trying to find the names and histories of people who participated in building this village when so many of those stories have been sort of stripped away from the narrative.
And your story, it follows the form of a particular instance of this happening. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so again, one of the things I researched when I was doing the novel was the Trent River train disaster, which was basically the collapse of a trestle. The train fell into the canyon. It was all very dramatic, and it made a fantastic set piece for my novel. But not everybody who was killed in that accident was recorded, because 2 of the men who were killed were of Japanese ancestry. So their names were sort of stricken from the record. And I, in the course of researching that disaster, found myself getting completely sidetracked into trying to find out who these 2 men were and what their lives were like. And that's really the basis of how that my nonfiction article for this anthology came to be.
What do you think this story tells us about Cumberland today, then?
I think the whole anthology really talks about how Cumberland is developing and diversifying, has a greater wealth of individual stories than are often shared. Often whenever you see anything about Cumberland, it's about coal mining and it's about labor history, and these things are very important. But there was a lot of other people who lived here whose stories weren't shared and weren't recorded. And I think that this anthology really calls to light the importance of seeing a community as multifaceted and diverse. And sometimes we don't get to see all of the different stories. We don't get to see all the different faces that a community is made up of. But that doesn't mean those people aren't just as important.
So having contributed to this and maybe having been a part of its development process or reading the other stories, what do you take away then about Cumberland as someone who has lived there and grown up there and spent years and years and years there? What was reading this collection like for you?
Well, it kind of reminded me that there's no place quite like Cumberland. I think for a long time, Cumberland was so quiet and sleepy, and now it's remarkably energetic and vivacious, and it continues to grow in such surprising and wonderful ways. I think this anthology kind of reminded me that sometimes it's hard to pin down exactly what Cumberland is, and that's kind of exciting.
How do you reflect on all of that change as someone who's lived through it firsthand?
It's a lot busier than it used to be when I was a kid. It's not nearly as quiet and sleepy, but I think there's some fantastic people who live here, and there's some remarkable events and initiatives that are happening. It's really positive and forward-thinking, and I find it very inspirational, actually, to see where Cumberland's going and how it's getting there.
Kim Bannerman is an author who lives in Cumberland and a contributor to A Place Called Cumberland, a compilation of 12 stories from the community's past put together by the Cumberland Museum and Archives. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.